Across the wine-dark Mediterranean, where ancient currents whispered secrets older than memory, two powers stirred like titans awakening from dreams. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that beneath its gentle waves lay the future of the world. On distant shores, merchants counted silver, while farmers tilled soil that would soon drink the blood of heroes. The scent of cedar and salt mingled with incense from 1,000 temples, where gods watched mortals play their eternal games of ambition and fate. In the gathering dusk of the ancient world, where purple-dyed sails caught the last light of dying suns, destiny itself began to weave the threads of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. The stage was set, the players ready, and time itself seemed to pause before the curtain rose on 3 acts of war that would echo through eternity. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. Long before Rome dreamed of empire, when the world was young and the Mediterranean stretched like an uncharted mirror beneath endless skies, the Phoenicians carved their destiny from cedar and salt. Along the eastern shores of that ancient sea, where Lebanon's mountains kissed the heavens, a people emerged who would teach the world the art of sailing beyond the horizon. Their cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, rose like jewels strung along the coast, each one a gateway between the known and the unknown. The Phoenicians were children of the sea, born with salt in their veins and stars in their eyes. They read the wind like poetry and understood the language of waves as others understood the speech of men. Their ships, sleek and graceful as seabirds, ventured where others feared to sail, carrying not just goods but dreams across the wine-dark waters. Purple dye from murex shells, cedar from their sacred groves, glass like captured sunlight. These treasures they traded for gold and silver, spices and stories from distant lands. But it was not wealth alone that drove them westward. Something deeper called to these maritime wanderers, a restless spirit that could not be contained by familiar shores. The sea whispered to them of lands beyond the setting sun, of islands where different gods held sway and different peoples dreamed different dreams. And so they followed the sun's path across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies like stepping stones across the ancient world. Sicily felt their presence first, that triangular island that seemed to float like a fallen star between Europe and Africa. Here, among olive groves and wheat fields, Phoenician merchants found willing partners in trade. The native Sicilians, skilled in their own crafts, welcomed these eastern visitors who brought exotic goods and new ideas. Temples rose to Phoenician gods alongside local shrines, and the island became a meeting place of cultures, a bridge between East and West. But Sicily was merely the first verse in a longer song. The Phoenicians pushed westward, their purple sails catching winds that carried them to Sardinia, to the coasts of Spain, to the Pillars of Hercules, where the Mediterranean met the endless Atlantic. Each new shore brought new opportunities, new peoples to trade with, new harbours to shelter their growing fleets. And then, in the shadow of North Africa's mountains, they found the bay that would change the course of history forever. Here, where the sea curved like a crescent moon, and the land rose in gentle hills dotted with olive trees, they established a settlement that would grow beyond their wildest dreams. They called it Qort Hadasht, the new city. The world would come to know it as Carthage. The traditional date of Carthage's founding, 814 BCE, may have been lost to the mists of time, but the story that emerged from those mists carried the weight of destiny. Queen Dido, fleeing the political turmoil of Tyre, led her followers to this African shore with nothing but hope and determination. The local Berber king, Iarbas, granted her only as much land as she could encompass with an ox hide, but Dido was clever as well as desperate. She cut the hide into the thinnest of strips and used them to encircle a hill overlooking the bay. On this hill, Byrsa, the citadel of Carthage, would rise. Whether Dido was history or legend mattered little to the generations that came after. What mattered was that Carthage grew, spreading from that first hill like ripples from a stone cast into still water. The harbour became the heart of the city, where ships from across the known world brought their cargoes to eager merchants. The circular ports, one military, one commercial, became marvels of engineering, protecting the Carthaginian fleet while welcoming friendly traders. As Carthage flourished, it became something more than just another Phoenician colony. The city developed its own character, its own ambitions, its own understanding of what it meant to be a power in the Mediterranean world. The old Phoenician homeland, pressured by Assyrians and Babylonians, began to fade in importance. But Carthage, young and vital, stepped forward to claim the mantle of Phoenician greatness. By the 6th century before Christ, Carthage had transformed from a refugee settlement into the merchant queen of the Western Mediterranean. Her influence spread like morning light across the ancient world, touching shores from Gibraltar to Sicily. The Carthaginians had inherited their ancestors' love of the sea, but they had added something uniquely their own, a hunger for territorial control that went beyond mere trading posts. The city itself had become a marvel of the ancient world. Rising from its bay like a white crown, Carthage housed perhaps 300,000 souls at its height. The residential districts climbed the hills in terraced splendor, where wealthy merchants built homes that rivaled those of Eastern kings. Gardens bloomed with exotic plants brought from distant lands, and fountains played with water channeled from mountain springs miles away. At the heart of the city stood the great temple of Tanit, the goddess who had become Carthage's special protector. Neither fully Phoenician nor entirely African, Tanit represented the unique fusion of cultures that made Carthage so distinctive. Her symbol, a triangle surmounted by a horizontal bar and crowned with a circle, appeared on coins and amulets, in mosaics and on the prows of ships. She was the guardian of fertility and the sea, of trade and warfare, of all the contradictions that made Carthage great. But it was in the harbours that Carthage's true character revealed itself. The merchant harbour buzzed with constant activity as ships from every corner of the Mediterranean unloaded their precious cargoes. Ivory from Africa, tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, silk from the distant lands beyond Persia, all found their way to Carthaginian warehouses. The city's merchants were legendary for their skill in negotiation, speaking a dozen languages and understanding the customs of 100 peoples. More impressive still was the military harbour hidden from prying eyes behind massive walls. Here, the Carthaginian navy maintained its fleet of warships in perfect readiness. The circular design allowed for maximum security, while providing berths for over 200 vessels. At the center rose the admiral's headquarters, from which the movements of the entire fleet could be coordinated. It was said that the Carthaginians could launch 100 ships in a single morning, their bronze rams gleaming like sharks' teeth as they sliced through the morning mist. The Carthaginian Empire, for that is what it had become, stretched along. The coasts of North Africa and Spain encompassed the Balearic Islands, dominated Sardinia and much of Sicily. Unlike other ancient empires built on conquest and tribute, Carthage's power rested on trade and naval supremacy. The Carthaginians were content to control the coasts and leave the interior to native peoples, as long as those peoples acknowledged Carthaginian authority and paid reasonable taxes. This approach created a unique kind of empire, one held together, not by marching legions, but by mutual profit and maritime dominance. The Carthaginians established colonies that were more like commercial outposts than military settlements. Each colony maintained its own local character, while contributing to the greater Carthaginian enterprise. Local gods were honored alongside Carthaginian deities. Local customs were respected as long as they didn't interfere with trade. The wealth generated by this commercial empire was staggering. Carthaginian coinage, bearing the symbols of horses and palm trees, was accepted from Britain to the Black Sea. The city's banks financed expeditions that brought back exotic goods and geographical knowledge. Carthaginian explorers pushed the boundaries of the known world, sailing down the African coast and possibly reaching the Atlantic islands centuries before anyone else. Perhaps most remarkably, Carthage developed a constitutional government that balanced the interests of its various classes and ethnic groups. Unlike the monarchies that dominated most of the ancient world, Carthage was ruled by annually elected suffetes, magistrates whose power was checked by a council of elders and popular assemblies. The merchant aristocracy dominated politics, but they had to consider the needs of artisans, sailors, and the large population of foreign residents who made the city their home. This political system, for all its complexity, proved remarkably stable. While other ancient cities were torn apart by civil wars and tyrannies, Carthage maintained a kind of commercial peace that allowed trade to flourish. The Carthaginians understood that stability was good for business, and they were, above all else, a practical people. Yet even as Carthage reached the height of its power and prosperity, seeds of future conflict were already being sown. The city's very success had made it the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, and dominance inevitably bred challenges. The Greek cities of Sicily looked with envy and fear at Carthaginian expansion. The native peoples of Spain and Africa, while generally content with Carthaginian rule, sometimes chafed under foreign authority. And far to the east in the hills of central Italy, a new power was beginning to stir, a city that would soon challenge not just Carthage's dominance, but its very existence. While Carthage built its empire on waves and winds, another city was carving its destiny from hill and stone. Rome in those distant days seemed an unlikely rival to Carthage's maritime magnificence. Set among 7 hills, beside the muddy Tiber, far from the sea that linked the ancient world, Rome appeared provincial compared to the cosmopolitan splendor of the Carthaginian capital. Yet beneath its rough exterior something extraordinary was taking shape. A military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Romans told stories of their origins that mixed legend with memory, weaving tales of Troy's fall and a wolf's mercy into their understanding of themselves. Whether Aeneas truly fled burning Troy to establish their bloodline, whether twin brothers Romulus and Remus were actually suckled by a she-wolf, mattered less than what these stories revealed about Roman character. They saw themselves as a people forged by struggle, tempered by hardship, destined to overcome any obstacle through discipline and determination. The early Roman kingdom had been replaced by a republic in 509 BCE, when the last of the proud kings was driven from the city. The Romans, having tasted freedom, swore never again to bow before a single ruler. Instead, they created a complex system of checks and balances, where power was shared among consuls and senate, tribunes, and assemblies. It was a system designed to prevent tyranny, even at the cost of occasional inefficiency. But the true genius of Rome lay not in its political innovations, but in its approach to warfare and expansion. Unlike Carthage, which sought to control trade routes and coastal territories, Rome pursued a different strategy entirely. The Romans fought to conquer, and they conquered to assimilate. Every victory brought new lands under Roman control. Every defeated enemy became either a Roman ally or a Roman citizen. This approach transformed military conflict from mere raiding or territorial dispute into something approaching total war. When the Romans fought, they fought to win completely and permanently. They didn't simply defeat their enemies, they absorbed them, turning former foes into future allies. It was a strategy that required tremendous military capability, but it also offered the promise of ever-expanding strength. The Roman military system was built around the citizen soldier, the farmer who put down his plough to take up sword and shield in defense of the Republic. These weren't professional warriors like the mercenaries that filled Carthaginian ranks, but neither were they unwilling conscripts. They were men with something to defend: their families, their farms, their way of life. They fought with the desperate courage of those who knew that defeat meant the loss of everything they held dear. Roman military organization reflected the society that created it. The legion was divided into centuries, each commanded by a centurion chosen for his proven courage and leadership. These centurions, often men of humble birth who had risen through merit rather than connections, formed the backbone of Roman military effectiveness. They knew their men personally, understood their strengths and weaknesses, and could inspire them to superhuman efforts when the situation demanded it. The Roman approach to equipment was characteristically practical. While other armies might favour elaborate armour and weapons designed to impress, Roman gear was built for effectiveness. The gladius, the short sword that became the symbol of Roman military might, was perfect for the close quarters combat that legions preferred. The scutum, the large rectangular shield, could protect a soldier individually or form an impenetrable wall when used collectively. Roman armour was sturdy rather than beautiful, designed to keep a soldier alive rather than make him look magnificent. But perhaps most importantly, the Romans understood logistics in a way that their enemies rarely matched. A Roman army could march farther, fight longer, and sustain itself in hostile territory better than any other military force of the ancient world. Roman engineers built roads that lasted centuries. Roman quartermasters organized supply lines that stretched across continents. Roman discipline ensured that orders were followed even when officers weren't watching. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Rome had established its dominance over central Italy through a combination of military, conquest, and diplomatic skill. The Romans offered their defeated enemies a choice: resist and be destroyed, or submit and be rewarded. Those who chose submission found themselves junior partners in an expanding confederation, allowed to maintain their local customs and gods while contributing soldiers and resources to the common cause. This policy created a reservoir of military manpower that grew with each successful campaign. As Rome's territory expanded, so did its ability to field larger armies. The Romans could lose battles, even suffer devastating defeats, and still continue fighting because they had access to seemingly unlimited reserves of manpower. It was a strategic advantage that would prove crucial in the conflicts to come. The expansion of Roman power inevitably brought them into contact with the wider Mediterranean world. Roman merchants began to compete with Carthaginian traders. Roman colonists began to eye territories that Carthage considered its own. The two powers, so different in character and approach, began to circle each other like wrestlers seeking the perfect hold. Yet even as tensions rose, few could have predicted the scale of the conflicts that lay ahead. Both Rome and Carthage were proud, ambitious powers with seemingly incompatible visions of their destiny. Rome dreamed of a universal empire, of bringing all peoples under the rule of law and order. Carthage envisioned a commercial empire that would span the oceans, connecting all shores in a web of mutual profit. Neither dream could accommodate the other's success. Sicily, that triangular jewel floating between the Italian peninsula and the coast of Africa, had always been a crossroads of civilizations. Its fertile fields and strategic harbors made it invaluable to any power-seeking dominance in the central Mediterranean. By the 3rd century BCE, the island had become a patchwork of competing authorities. Greek cities in the east, Carthaginian territories in the west, and native Sicilians caught between the ambitions of greater powers. The eastern half of Sicily remained largely Greek in character, a legacy of the great colonization movement that had carried Hellenic culture across the Mediterranean centuries. Earlier, cities like Syracuse had grown wealthy and powerful, their tyrants ruling with the sophistication and brutality that characterized Greek politics. These were not the simple democracies of classical Athens, but complex societies where merchant princes and military strongmen vied for control while common citizens hoped merely to be left in peace. Carthaginian Sicily was different in character, reflecting the commercial priorities of its rulers. The Carthaginians had established themselves in the western portion of the island gradually through a combination of treaty-making and conquest that prioritized economic advantage over territorial glory. Cities like Panormus and Lilybaeum became Carthaginian strongholds, their harbors serving as bases for the fleets that protected Carthaginian trade routes throughout the western Mediterranean. Between these two spheres of influence lay a complex web of local powers, native Sicilian communities that had maintained their independence through careful diplomacy and mutual defense pacts. These peoples had learned to play the larger powers against each other, offering alliance to whichever side could provide the best terms while maintaining their essential autonomy. It was a delicate balance that had worked for generations, but it was a balance that could not survive the arrival of a third major power. The Romans had long been aware of Sicily's importance, but they had hesitated to become directly involved in the island's affairs. Rome's military might was primarily land-based, and Sicily was separated from Italy by the narrow but treacherous Strait of Messina. More importantly, direct intervention in Sicily would inevitably bring Rome into conflict with Carthage, a prospect that even the confident Romans approached with caution. The crisis that would shatter Sicily's delicate equilibrium began, ironically, with a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. These sons of Mars had originally served the tyrant of Syracuse, but after his death they had seized the city of Messana and established themselves as its rulers. The Mamertines proved to be troublesome neighbors, raiding throughout northeastern Sicily and threatening the stability of the entire region. Hiero Tanit, the new tyrant of Syracuse, decided to deal with the Mamertine problem decisively. His forces trapped the mercenaries in Messana and prepared to destroy them completely. Facing annihilation, the Mamertines made a desperate appeal for help to any power that might be willing to assist them. Some turned to Carthage, others to Rome. Both powers had reasons to intervene, and both had reasons to hesitate. For Carthage, the situation presented both opportunity and danger. Establishing a garrison in Messana would give the Carthaginians control of the strait between Sicily and Italy, a strategic position of immense value. But it would also require direct military intervention in Sicilian affairs, something that might provoke a wider conflict with Syracuse or even Rome. The Carthaginian Senate debated the matter extensively before deciding to accept the Mamertine appeal and dispatch a garrison to Messana. The Roman response was more complex, reflecting the republican system's tendency toward lengthy deliberation. The Senate was divided about the wisdom of intervention, recognizing that any move into Sicily would fundamentally alter Rome's strategic position. Some senators argued that Rome had no business interfering in Sicilian affairs, that the Republic's destiny lay in the conquest of Italy rather than overseas adventures. Others maintained that Roman security required preventing any single power from dominating Sicily completely. The debate in Rome was not merely strategic, but moral. The Mamertines were, after all, Italian mercenaries who had appealed to Rome for protection. Could the Republic abandon fellow Italians to foreign domination? Yet the Mamertines were also bandits who had seized Messana through treachery and violence. Did such men deserve Roman protection? The moral dimension of the question complicated an already difficult strategic decision. Eventually, the Roman Popular Assembly decided the matter by accepting the Mamertine appeal, overriding senatorial hesitation through direct democratic action. A Roman consul was authorized to cross into Sicily with sufficient forces to protect Messana and its Italian garrison. It was presented as a limited intervention, a simple rescue mission that would not materially alter the balance of power in Sicily. Few Romans realized that they were taking the first step toward a conflict that would last more than a century and reshape the entire Mediterranean world. The Roman expedition to Sicily began as a modest affair. Consul Appius Claudius Caudex crossed the strait with a small force, expecting to negotiate a quick resolution to the Messana crisis. Instead, he found himself facing a coalition of Carthaginians and Syracusans who had united to oppose Roman intervention. The limited rescue mission suddenly became something much larger and more dangerous. The first battles were small affairs, skirmishes rather than major engagements, but they established the pattern that would characterize the long conflict ahead. Roman legions, designed for warfare in the hills and plains of Italy, found themselves adapting to new conditions and new enemies. Carthaginian forces, accustomed to the mobile warfare of mercenary armies, discovered that Roman discipline and determination made them formidable opponents, even in unfamiliar terrain. As the fighting intensified, both sides began to commit larger forces to Sicily. What had begun as a minor intervention escalated into a major campaign, then into something approaching total war. The island that had served as a crossroads of peaceful commerce became a battleground where the fate of two empires would be decided. The First Punic War had begun, though few yet realized the full magnitude of what they had unleashed. The transformation of Sicily from a peaceful crossroads into a theatre of war marked more than just the beginning of a military conflict. It represented the collision of two fundamentally different approaches to power and empire. Rome and Carthage, each confident in its own strength and destiny, had finally been forced into direct confrontation. Neither could back down without appearing weak. Neither could advance without risking everything. The die had been cast, and the ancient world would never be the same. As the sun set over the Sicilian hills in that fateful year of 264 BCE, casting long shadows across olive groves and wheat fields that would soon run red with blood, the Mediterranean world balanced on the edge of an abyss. Two of history's greatest powers were about to test their strength against each other in a conflict that would span generations and consume the lives of hundreds of thousands. The prize was not merely Sicily, nor even dominance of the Western Mediterranean, but the right to shape the future of civilization itself. In the growing darkness, as Roman campfires flickered to life across from Carthaginian positions, destiny itself seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set, the players positioned across the Mediterranean's vast expanse like pieces on a divine game board. Sicily, that triangular jewel suspended between two worlds, would become the spark that ignited a fire lasting over a century. The year was 264 BCE, and neither Rome nor Carthage could have foreseen that their first tentative clash would evolve into a struggle that would reshape the ancient world forever. In the city of Messana, perched on Sicily's northeastern tip, chaos reigned. The Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized control of this strategic port, found themselves caught between advancing Syracusans and their own desperate circumstances. These warriors, whose name meant Sons of Mars, had ruled through violence and now faced the consequences of their brutal reign. Syracuse, under King Hiero II, pressed them from the south, while Carthaginian ships patrolled the waters nearby, waiting like patient predators. The Mamertines, in their desperation, made a decision that would echo through history. They sent envoys in two directions, one to Carthage, seeking protection under Punic authority, and another to Rome, appealing to their Italian kinship. It was a gamble born of desperation, but one that would drag two empires into war. Carthage, responded first. Their admiral, Hanno, sailed into Messana's harbour with a small fleet, establishing a garrison in the city's citadel. For a moment, it seemed the matter was settled. Sicily would remain under Carthaginian influence, and the balance of Mediterranean power would continue unchanged. But Rome, that growing republic across the narrow strait, had other intentions. The Roman Senate debated long into the night. The older senators, wise in the ways of tradition, counselled caution. Sicily was far from Rome's immediate concerns, and the Mamertines were hardly worthy allies. Why risk war with mighty Carthage over a band of mercenaries? But younger voices spoke of opportunity, of the riches that Sicily's fertile fields could provide, of the strategic importance of controlling the passage between Italy and Africa. Appius Claudius Caudex, the Roman consul, embodied this aggressive spirit. He was a man of action, impatient with deliberation, eager to prove Roman strength beyond the Italian peninsula. When the Senate finally voted to intervene, it was by the narrowest of margins, a decision that would commit Rome to a path from which there would be no turning back. The Roman fleet that crossed the Strait of Messina in 264 BCE was modest by later standards, but it represented something unprecedented. Rome's first major military venture beyond Italian shores. Appius Claudius landed his legions on Sicilian soil under cover of darkness, knowing that Carthaginian ships controlled the surrounding waters. The die was cast, and neither empire could retreat without losing face. Hanno, the Carthaginian commander, in Messana, found himself in an impossible position. The Romans had landed in force, and the Mamertines, those fickle mercenaries, now openly favoured their Italian cousins over their Punic protectors. Rather than face a siege with uncertain local support, Hanno chose withdrawal, abandoning the citadel and sailing back to Carthage. It was a prudent decision that would cost him dearly. His own government would crucify him for this perceived cowardice. But Carthage's response was swift and decisive. If Rome wanted Sicily, they would have to fight for every grain of sand. The Carthaginian Senate dispatched a large army to the island, while their fleet moved to blockade Roman supply lines. More significantly, they forged an alliance with Syracuse, bringing King Hiero II and his considerable forces into the conflict. The Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded, with enemies on land and sea. The siege of Syracuse in 263 BCE marked Rome's first major test in the Punic Wars. The legions that had conquered Italy faced an entirely different kind of warfare on Sicily's sun-baked plains. Syracuse was no hill town to be taken by storm. It was a fortress city defended by Greek military science and Carthaginian gold. The Romans learned quickly that their traditional tactics, designed for fighting fellow Italians, would need adaptation for this broader stage. Marcus Valerius Maximus, leading the Roman assault, discovered that siege warfare required patience, engineering skill, and resources that Rome was still learning to marshal. The walls of Syracuse, strengthened by generations of Greek innovation, presented challenges that simple Roman courage could not overcome. For months, the legions settled into the grinding routine of blockade and bombardment, while disease and heat took their toll on men accustomed to Italy's milder climate. Yet Rome's persistence paid unexpected dividends. King Hiero II, observing the Roman character during the long siege, began to question his Carthaginian alliance. These Romans, unlike the Carthaginians, seemed to fight for something beyond mere profit. Their discipline under hardship, their methodical approach to seemingly impossible tasks, suggested a different kind of enemy, one that might prove a better friend than the merchants of Carthage. In a stunning reversal that would characterize much of the Punic Wars, Hiero II secretly negotiated a separate peace with Rome. The Syracusan king agreed to pay tribute and provide supplies to the Roman legions, effectively switching sides in the middle of the conflict. This diplomatic coup gave Rome its first major victory in the war, not through conquest, but through the art of alliance. The Carthaginian position on Sicily suddenly became precarious. With Syracuse neutralized and Roman reinforcements arriving from Italy, the Punic forces found themselves confined to the island's western regions, centered on their ancient strongholds of Lilybaeum and Drepanum. The war that had begun as a limited intervention over Messana was expanding into a full-scale contest for Sicily's soul. The Romans, bred on the hills of Latium and trained in the tactics of land warfare, faced their greatest challenge in the waters surrounding Sicily. Carthage had ruled the western Mediterranean for centuries, their ships carrying trade goods and their admirals commanding respect from Gibraltar to the Levant. The Punic navy was not merely a military force. It was the foundation of Carthaginian power, the source of their wealth, and the guardian of their empire. Roman naval experience, by contrast, was almost non-existent. The Latin fleet consisted mainly of coastal vessels, suitable for short trips, but hardly capable of challenging Carthaginian dominance. Yet the Romans, with characteristic pragmatism, recognized that they could not win the Sicilian War without control of the sea. If they remained dependent on land bridges and friendly ports, Carthage would always hold the strategic advantage. The solution came through a stroke of fortune that the Romans would later attribute to divine favor. A Carthaginian quinquereme, one of their finest warships, ran aground on the Italian coast while attempting to raid Roman supply lines. Instead of burning the vessel, the Romans captured it intact, providing them with a blueprint for naval construction unlike anything they had previously possessed. Within months, Roman shipyards along the Italian coast buzzed with unprecedented activity. Using the captured Carthaginian vessel as a model, Roman engineers and craftsmen began producing their own fleet of quinqueremes. They worked with the methodical determination that had built their roads and aqueducts, applying terrestrial engineering principles to maritime challenges. But building ships was only half the challenge. The Romans needed to train crews, develop naval tactics, and overcome centuries of Carthaginian maritime supremacy. Here, Roman innovation combined with their talent. For adaptation, unable to match Carthaginian seamanship, they decided to transform naval warfare into something resembling land combat. The Corvus, or Raven, was perhaps the most ingenious military device of the First Punic War. This boarding bridge, equipped with a heavy spike and operated by pulleys, could be dropped onto enemy vessels, locking them together and allowing Roman marines to charge across as if storming a fortress. The Corvus transformed the quinquereme from a vessel of maneuver into a mobile platform for the Roman talent for close combat. Gaius Duilius, the Roman admiral who first deployed the Corvus in battle, understood that this device could neutralize Carthaginian advantages. When his fleet encountered the Carthaginians off Mylae in 260 BCE, the Punic commanders expected an easy victory over these Roman novices. Instead, they found their ships grappled and boarded, their crews facing Roman legionaries in the confined spaces of ship decks. The Battle of Mylae was Rome's first significant naval victory, and its psychological impact far exceeded its tactical importance. The Romans had proven they could challenge Carthage on the sea, that domain which the Punics had considered their exclusive preserve. Word of the victory spread throughout the Mediterranean, announcing to Greek cities and Gallic tribes that a new power was rising to challenge Carthaginian supremacy. Duilius returned to Rome in triumph, awarded the first naval triumph in Roman history. The victory column erected in his honor bore the bronze beaks of captured Carthaginian ships, and for the rest of his life he was preceded by torch-bearers and flute players whenever he walked the streets at night, honors that reminded all Romans of their new mastery over the waves. Yet Carthage was far from defeated. The loss at Mylae stung, but it also revealed Roman weaknesses. These new naval warriors, for all their courage and innovation, lacked the seamanship that came only from generations of maritime experience. Carthaginian admirals began developing tactics to exploit this inexperience, using their superior maneuverability to avoid the dreaded Corvus and fight in the traditional manner of ramming and boarding. Success at sea emboldened Roman ambitions beyond Sicily's shores. By 256 BCE, with their new navy proving capable of challenging Carthaginian supremacy, Roman strategic thinking began to evolve. Why fight for Sicily when they could strike at Carthage itself? The idea of carrying the war to Africa, of threatening the enemy's homeland while protecting their own, appealed to Roman sensibilities trained in decisive action. Marcus Attilius, Regulus embodied this aggressive Roman spirit. A consul of proven courage and unlimited confidence, he convinced the Senate that a direct assault on Carthaginian territory would end the war quickly and decisively. The Romans had learned much about warfare beyond Italy, and they believed their legions could succeed where others had failed. Africa, after all, was just another territory to be conquered, its people merely another enemy to be subdued. The Roman fleet that sailed from Sicily toward the African coast in 256 BCE was the largest naval force Rome had ever assembled. Over 300 ships carried 2 full consular armies, complete with cavalry, supplies, and siege equipment. It was an investment that represented Rome's commitment to victory, a gamble that would either secure Mediterranean dominance or bankrupt the growing republic. The Carthaginians, recognizing the mortal threat to their homeland, assembled their own fleet to intercept this Roman invasion. The resulting battle off Cape Ecnomus became one of the largest naval engagements in ancient history, with over 600 ships and 300,000 men clashing in the waters between Sicily and Africa. The scale was unprecedented, the stakes absolute. Roman naval tactics had evolved since Mylae. Their commanders arranged their ships in a complex formation designed to protect the transport vessels while maximizing the effectiveness of their Corvus-equipped warships. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, relied on traditional tactics of ramming and maneuver, hoping to break the Roman line before those deadly boarding bridges could be deployed. The battle raged from dawn until late afternoon, with individual ship duels scattered across miles of Mediterranean waters. Roman discipline gradually prevailed over Carthaginian seamanship, as the Corvus once again proved its worth in transforming naval combat into something resembling land warfare. By evening, the Carthaginian fleet was in retreat, leaving the Romans free to continue their voyage to Africa. Regulus landed his legions on the African coast near the ancient city of Aspis, modern Libya in Tunisia. For the first time since Agathocles of Syracuse over 50 years earlier, foreign soldiers stood on Carthaginian soil with conquest in mind. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. Romans felt they had brought the war to its inevitable conclusion, while Carthaginians faced the prospect of their homeland becoming a battlefield. The Roman advance inland was initially successful. African cities, many of them tributaries rather than full Carthaginian colonies, offered little resistance to these disciplined Italian warriors. Some settlements even welcomed the Romans, hoping to throw off Carthaginian taxation and control. Within weeks, Regulus controlled a substantial portion of the Carthaginian hinterland and was receiving embassies from tribes seeking Roman alliance. Carthage itself, that ancient city, founded by Dido according to legend, found itself besieged for the first time in centuries. The walls that had protected generations of Punic merchants and sailors now sheltered a population facing the very real possibility of Roman conquest. Panic gripped the streets as citizens contemplated the fate that had befallen other enemies of Rome, yet Carthage's desperation bred innovation. Unable to defeat the Romans with traditional forces, the Carthaginian government sought help from an unexpected source: Greek military advisors who brought with them the latest developments in Hellenistic warfare. Chief among these was Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary whose knowledge of combined arms tactics would prove crucial to Carthaginian survival. Xanthippus immediately recognized the flaws in Carthaginian military organization. Their forces lacked coordination between infantry, cavalry, and elephants, fighting more like three separate armies than a unified force. Under his guidance, Carthaginian forces began training in the sophisticated tactics that had made Hellenistic armies the terror of the Eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, Xanthippus understood Roman weaknesses. These legions, so effective in the varied terrain of Italy and Sicily, were fighting in the open plains of North Africa, where their traditional tactics were less effective. Here, cavalry and elephants could be used to maximum advantage, while Roman discipline and close formation could be turned against them. The reformed Carthaginian army that faced Regulus in 255 BCE bore little resemblance to the forces that had fled from Roman advances. War elephants, those living siege engines of the ancient world, led the charge while Numidian cavalry swept around the Roman flanks. For the first time since the war began, Roman legions faced defeat in the field. The Battle of the Bagradus River was a catastrophe for Roman arms. Regulus himself was captured, along with the remnants of his army, while the few survivors fled to their ships and the safety of the sea. The Roman invasion of Africa ended not in triumph but in disaster, with thousands of legionaries dead or enslaved and their commander a prisoner in Carthaginian hands. News of Regulus's defeat reached Rome like a thunderbolt, shattering the confidence that had grown from early victories. The African venture, conceived in ambition and executed with typical Roman determination, had ended in humiliation. For the first time since the war began, Romans faced the possibility that Carthage might prove unconquerable. that their growing empire might have found its limits in the ancient Punic city. The Roman response was characteristic of their republic's resilience. Rather than seeking peace from a position of weakness, they immediately began preparing a relief expedition to rescue the survivors of Regulus's army. New legions were raised, additional ships constructed, and fresh commanders appointed. The disaster in Africa became not a reason for surrender, but a motivation for greater effort. Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Nobilia, the new consuls, sailed for Africa with a fleet larger than Regulus had commanded. Their mission was limited but essential. Evacuate the remaining Roman forces from their precarious foothold on the African coast, and deny Carthage the propaganda victory of completely eliminating Roman presence in their homeland. The evacuation from Aspis in 255 BCE was a masterpiece of Roman logistics under pressure. Despite Carthaginian attempts to prevent their escape, the Romans successfully withdrew their remaining forces along with thousands of captured Carthaginians. The retreat was orderly, professional, and complete, a demonstration that Roman military efficiency survived even devastating defeat. Yet the gods, it seemed, were not finished with Roman ambitions. The fleet carrying the rescued legions back to Sicily encountered a storm off Cape Pechinus that became legend in Roman naval history. The same waters that had witnessed their victory at Ecnomus now became a graveyard for Roman ships, with over 200 vessels lost to wind and wave. In a single night, the disaster off Pechinus was worse than any military defeat. Entire legions, veterans who had survived African battlefields, drowned within sight of Sicilian shores. The loss was not just tactical, but deeply personal. Every Roman family seemed to have lost sons, fathers, or brothers to the Mediterranean's fury. Some whispered that the gods had turned against Rome's imperial ambitions. Carthage, meanwhile, was dealing with its own complexities of victory. Xanthippus, the Spartan mercenary whose tactics had saved their homeland, found himself too successful for his own good. Carthaginian oligarchs, suspicious of foreign influence and jealous of Greek military genius, arranged for his quiet removal from the scene. Success in war, they understood, must not come at the cost of Carthaginian independence. The war returned to Sicily with renewed intensity. Both sides had learned costly lessons from the African venture. Rome about the limits of ambition, Carthage about the effectiveness of professional military leadership. The conflict that had begun as a limited intervention over Messana was evolving into something larger and more bitter, a struggle that would test both civilizations to their limits. Roman efforts now focused on the two remaining Carthaginian strongholds in western Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepanum. These ancient cities, fortified by generations of Punic engineers and supplied by Carthaginian fleets, represented the last obstacles to Roman control of Sicily. Their capture would require all the siegecraft and persistence that had made Rome master of Italy. Lilybaeum, in particular, became a symbol of Carthaginian resistance. Built on a promontory jutting into the Mediterranean, surrounded by walls, and supplied by sea, it seemed almost impregnable to Roman assault. Previous attackers, including the great Dionysius of Syracuse, had failed to capture this fortress, and its defenders were confident that Roman persistence would prove equally futile. The Roman siege of Lilybaeum beginning in 250 BCE, would become one of the longest and most determined in ancient history. Consul after consul arrived with fresh legions, new siege engines, and renewed determination to crack this Carthaginian nut. The siege became a school of military engineering, where Romans learned the arts of sapping, countermining, and naval blockade. Yet for all their effort, Lilybaeum held. Carthaginian ships, taking advantage of their superior seamanship, repeatedly broke through Roman naval blockades to resupply the fortress. The city's defenders, a mix of Carthaginian regulars and Gallic mercenaries, fought with the desperation of men who knew that surrender meant crucifixion or slavery. The stalemate at Lilybaeum reflected the larger strategic situation. Neither Rome nor Carthage could achieve decisive victory in the traditional sense. Roman legions could not capture fortified cities supplied by sea, while Carthaginian forces could not break Roman control of most of Sicily. The war was entering a new phase, one that would test endurance rather than tactical brilliance. It was during this period of grinding attrition that one of the war's most famous episodes occurred. Marcus Atilius Regulus, the Roman commander captured at the Bagradas River, was reportedly sent to Rome by his Carthaginian captors to negotiate a prisoner exchange and possible peace terms. According to later Roman historians, Regulus used his opportunity to speak before the Senate to urge continued war, then voluntarily returned to Carthage to face inevitable execution. Whether the story of Regulus's noble sacrifice is historical, fact or later, Roman propaganda matters less than its symbolic importance. The tale captured everything Romans believed about their own character: duty, honor, and devotion to the Republic above personal survival. In the growing mythology of the Punic Wars, Regulus became the embodiment of Roman virtue facing Carthaginian treachery. The war ground on, consuming the resources and manpower of both republics. Roman persistence gradually wore down Carthaginian resistance, while Carthaginian resilience frustrated Roman hopes for quick victory. By 247 BCE, after 17 years of conflict, both sides were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their populations weary of seemingly endless war. Yet it was precisely at this moment of mutual exhaustion that Carthage produced its greatest military genius. Hamilcar Barca, whose very name would become synonymous with Carthaginian resistance, arrived in Sicily with a small force and a determination to revive Punic fortunes. The war that seemed to be ending in stalemate was about to enter its most dramatic phase. Hamilcar was everything that previous Carthaginian commanders had not been. Innovative in tactics, inspiring to his men, and utterly committed to victory over Rome. Unlike the cautious oligarchs who had dominated Carthaginian strategy, Hamilcar understood that this war would be won not by avoiding defeat, but by achieving decisive victory. His arrival in Sicily marked the beginning of the conflict's final and most crucial phase. From his mountain stronghold at Eryx, Hamilcar launched raid after raid against Roman positions, using guerrilla tactics that kept the legions constantly off balance. He understood that Carthage could not win a war of attrition against Rome's superior manpower, but might succeed through a campaign of constant harassment that would wear down Roman will to continue the conflict. For 3 years, Hamilcar's small army bedeviled Roman forces throughout western Sicily. He captured supply convoys, ambushed isolated units, and struck at Roman coastal positions before disappearing back into the mountains. His success inspired other Carthaginian commanders and revived hope in Carthage itself that the war might yet be won. But Rome's fundamental advantages, greater manpower, superior resources, and the ability to sustain losses that would cripple smaller states, gradually told. Hamilcar's brilliance could not overcome the basic strategic situation. As long as Rome controlled the sea lanes between Sicily and Africa, Carthage could not adequately supply and reinforce its Sicilian forces. The war would ultimately be decided not by tactical genius, but by naval supremacy. The final phase of the First Punic War would be decided not on the battlefields of Sicily, but in the shipyards and treasuries of both republics. Whichever side could build and maintain the larger fleet would control Sicily's fate. The war that had begun with land battles over Messana would end with a naval battle that determined Mediterranean supremacy for generations to come. The young Hannibal Barca stood before the altar of Melkart, his small hand clasped firmly in his father's weathered grasp. The sacred flames danced in the shadows of the temple, casting long fingers of light across the stone floor where countless Carthaginian nobles had sworn their oaths. But this oath was different. This was the oath of a child who would grow to shake the very foundations of Rome itself. Hamilcar Barca, the Lion of Carthage who had never known defeat on the battlefield, gazed down at his 9-year-old son with eyes that held both pride and profound sorrow. The wounds of the First Punic War still festered in his heart. The memory of Carthage's humiliation, a constant ache that drove him forward into the Spanish wilderness. Before him knelt not just his son, but the vessel of his vengeance, the instrument through which Carthage might yet reclaim her glory. "Swear to me," Hamilcar whispered, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "that you will never be a friend to Rome. Swear that you will spend your life as their enemy, that you will pursue them with fire and sword until either they or you lie dead beneath the sun." The boy's voice, clear and unwavering despite his youth, echoed through the temple chamber. "I swear it, father, by Melkart, by Tanit, by all the gods of Carthage, I swear eternal enmity to Rome." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread across the Mediterranean world and shape the destiny of nations. For 9 years, Hannibal learned the arts of war and statecraft at his father's side in the rich lands of Hispania. He watched as Hamilcar carved out a new empire from the Spanish tribes, building a power base that would serve as the launching point for Carthage's revenge. When Hamilcar fell in battle in 228 BCE, struck down while besieging a Spanish stronghold, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair assumed command of the Carthaginian forces. But all eyes turned to the young Hannibal, now grown into a man of 26, his father's fire burning bright within him. The soldiers of Carthage's Spanish army saw in Hannibal something that transcended mere nobility of birth. They saw a commander who could march beside them through the deepest snow and the burning desert sand, who shared their meals and their dangers, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of battle and turn seeming defeat into glorious victory. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, the army's choice was unanimous. Hannibal Barca would lead them. Rome watched nervously as reports arrived of the young Carthaginian general's growing power. The treaty that had ended the First Punic War included a provision that Carthage would not cross the Ebro River in Spain, creating a buffer zone between Carthaginian territory and the Roman sphere of influence. But the Spanish city of Saguntum, though south of the Ebro, had placed itself under Roman protection, a deliberate provocation that both sides understood would inevitably lead to war. In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. The city's walls, built of massive stone blocks and defended by warriors who knew that surrender meant death or slavery, seemed impregnable. For 8 months, the siege dragged on while Roman ambassadors traveled to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over for his aggression. The Carthaginian Senate, still smarting from their previous defeat, faced an impossible choice: sacrifice their greatest general or face Rome's wrath once more. The siege of Saguntum became a test of wills between two great civilizations. Within the city's walls, men, women, and children faced starvation and disease, yet they held firm in their loyalty to Rome. Hannibal's forces, meanwhile, employed every tool of ancient warfare: battering rams that thundered against the gates, siege towers that loomed like wooden mountains, tunnels that snaked beneath the foundations like serpents seeking their prey. The young general himself could be seen in the thick of the fighting, his bronze armor gleaming as he led assault after assault against the crumbling defenses. When Saguntum finally fell, its destruction was total. The city that had dared to defy, Carthage was reduced to rubble and ash, its population sold into slavery, its very stones scattered to the winds. But the conquest of Saguntum was more than a military victory. It was Hannibal's declaration of war against Rome itself, his answer to the oath he had sworn as a child before the altar of Melkart. Rome's response came swiftly. The Senate dispatched an embassy to Carthage, bearing an ultimatum wrapped in the formal language of diplomacy, but unmistakable in its meaning: surrender Hannibal or face war. The chief Roman ambassador, Quintus Fabius Maximus, appeared before the Carthaginian Senate, carrying a fold of his toga that he claimed contained both peace and war. "Choose," he declared, "which you will have." The Carthaginian response was equally direct: "Give us whichever you prefer." Fabius let the fold fall and replied, "I give you war." So began the Second Punic War, a conflict that would rage for 17 years and test the very survival of both civilizations. But Hannibal had been preparing for this moment his entire life. While Rome expected him to fight a defensive war in Spain, or perhaps attempt another naval assault on Sicily, the young Carthaginian general had conceived a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. He would march his army overland to Italy, crossing the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and the Alps to bring war to Rome's very doorstep. In the spring of 218 BCE, as the first flowers bloomed in the Spanish countryside, Hannibal began assembling an army unlike any the world had ever seen. From across the length and breadth of Carthage's domains came warriors eager to follow the son of Hamilcar on his impossible quest. There were Libyan infantry, battle-hardened veterans of countless campaigns in the African desert. Numidian cavalry rode in from the southern reaches, their horses swift as the wind, and their riders skilled beyond measure in the arts of mounted warfare. Spanish Celtiberians joined the growing host, fierce warriors who had learned to respect Carthaginian arms and now sought glory in their service. From the Balearic Islands came slingers whose accuracy with their simple weapons had become legendary. Men who could strike down a bird in flight or pick off an enemy officer at seemingly impossible range. And most spectacular of all were the war elephants, 37 massive beasts from the forests of North Africa, each one a living siege engine capable of trampling enemy formations into dust. The army that finally crossed the Ebro River in May 218 BCE numbered perhaps 100,000 men, a vast multicultural force bound together by loyalty to their young general and dreams of Roman gold. Hannibal had spent months preparing for this moment, studying maps, questioning merchants and travelers about the routes across the Alps, gathering intelligence about the tribes that dwelt in the mountain passes. He knew the journey would cost him dearly in men and equipment, but he also knew that if he could bring even a portion of his army safely to Italy, he would have achieved something no enemy of Rome had ever accomplished. The march north through the Pyrenees proved more difficult than anticipated. The mountain tribes, fierce warriors who owed allegiance to no distant power, harassed the Carthaginian columns with hit-and-run attacks that slowly bled away Hannibal's strength. By the time the army reached the Rhone River in southern Gaul, their numbers had been reduced to perhaps 90,000 men, and the most challenging part of the journey still lay ahead. The crossing of the Rhone became an epic unto itself. The river ran deep and swift, swollen with mountain snowmelt, its banks lined with hostile Gallic tribes who saw the Carthaginian army as a threat to their independence. Hannibal's engineers worked feverishly to construct bridges and rafts while his soldiers fought off constant attacks from the Gauls. The war elephants posed a particular challenge. How does one convince a massive intelligent animal to cross a raging river on a makeshift raft? Hannibal's solution was typically ingenious. His men constructed specially reinforced rafts, then covered them with soil and vegetation to make them appear like solid ground. The elephants, trusting their handlers, walked aboard what they believed to be an extension of the riverbank. Only, when the rafts were pushed into the current, did the great beasts realize their predicament. But by then, it was too late to turn back. Some elephants panicked and fell into the water, but their trunks served as natural snorkels, allowing them to swim to safety on the far bank, while their mahouts clung desperately to their backs. Word of the Carthaginian advance had reached Rome, but the Senate found it difficult to believe that Hannibal would attempt something so seemingly impossible as crossing the Alps with an army. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, dispatched with an army to intercept the Carthaginians in Spain, arrived at the Rhone only to discover that his quarry had already vanished into the mountain passes. A brief cavalry skirmish confirmed what seemed incredible. Hannibal was indeed marching towards the Alps. The approach to the mountains filled even Hannibal's veterans with unease. As autumn advanced and the peaks grew white with snow, the army found itself entering a realm that seemed hostile to human life itself. The local Gallic tribes, some friendly and some openly hostile, warned of passes already blocked by early snow, of avalanches that could bury entire companies, of cold so intense that men would freeze to death in their sleep. But Hannibal had come too far to turn back now. The oath sworn in childhood, the fall of Saguntum, the challenge hurled at Rome, All of it had led to this moment when his army would either achieve the impossible or perish in the attempt. As the first snows began to fall on the mountain slopes, the Carthaginian general ordered his men forward into the realm of ice and stone, where no army had ever dared to tread. The Alpine crossing became a nightmare of cold, hunger, and constant danger. The narrow mountain trails, treacherous even in good weather, became death traps where a single misstep could send man and horse tumbling into bottomless chasms. Landslides triggered by the army's passage or by hostile mountain tribes buried soldiers beneath tons of rock and earth. The bitter cold claimed victims every night, men who simply never woke from their exhausted sleep. Most challenging of all was moving the war elephants through terrain that seemed designed to defeat them. The great beasts, accustomed to the warm plains of Africa and Spain, suffered terribly in the mountain cold. Their feet, soft from walking on sandy ground, were torn and bloodied by the sharp rocks. Several times the column had to halt while engineers carved new paths through solid rock, using fire and vinegar to split the stone when conventional tools proved inadequate. The mountain tribes added to the army's ordeal, rolling boulders down on the marching columns and attacking the baggage trains. These warriors, hardy men who lived their entire lives in the thin air and bitter cold of the high peaks, moved through the treacherous terrain with the ease of mountain goats. They struck without warning and vanished into the mist and snow, leaving behind only Carthaginian dead and the echo of their war cries among the crags. Hannibal himself was everywhere during the crossing, encouraging his men, sharing their hardships, always visible in his distinctive armor and scarlet cloak. When a crucial pass was blocked by a massive landslide, he personally supervised the engineers who used fire and primitive explosives to blast a path through the obstruction. When supplies ran low, he ordered his own rations distributed among the soldiers. When men began to despair and talk of turning back, his presence alone was enough to restore their determination. For 15 days, the army struggled through the high passes. Each morning brought new challenges. Rivers turned to ice overnight, trails that vanished into sheer cliff faces. The discovery that a pass thought to be open was actually blocked by insurmountable barriers. Men and animals died not in the glory of battle, but in the simple struggle to survive in a landscape that seemed designed to destroy them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of suffering, the advance scouts brought word that set the entire army rejoicing. Ahead lay the descent into Italy, and beyond the mountain peaks they could see the green plains of the Po Valley spread out like a promised land. The worst of the crossing was behind them, though even the descent would claim more lives as exhausted men and animals stumbled on the treacherous downward paths. When Hannibal's army finally emerged from the Alps and made camp in the territory of the Taurini tribe, they had been transformed by their ordeal. The force that had crossed the Ebro River 5 months earlier had numbered close to 100,000 men. The army that now prepared to challenge Rome in her own homeland counted perhaps 26,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and fewer than 20 surviving war elephants. But those who remained were no longer merely soldiers. They were warriors forged in the crucible of the mountains, bonded together by shared suffering and devoted to their general with a loyalty that bordered on worship. The news of Hannibal's successful Alpine crossing struck Rome like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. In the Senate House, where marble columns had witnessed centuries of debate and decision, An unusual silence fell as the impossible became reality. A Carthaginian army, battered but still formidable, now stood on Italian soil, ready to challenge Rome's dominion over the peninsula that was the foundation of her power. The consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had failed to intercept Hannibal at the Rhone, hurried back to northern Italy with what forces he could gather. Meanwhile, his fellow consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus was recalled from Sicily, where he had been preparing for an invasion of Africa. The Roman strategy was simple: combine their armies and crush this Carthaginian upstart before he could gain allies among Rome's Italian subjects. But Hannibal had not come to Italy merely to fight Romans. He had come to break the confederation that was the source of Rome's strength. Across the length and breadth of the peninsula lived peoples who had been conquered by Roman arms and bound to Rome by treaties that often favored the dominant power. Many of these Italian allies harbored resentments, nurturing dreams of independence that had been suppressed but never extinguished. The Carthaginian general's first objective was to secure his position in northern Italy and begin the delicate work of diplomacy that would turn Rome's allies against her. The Gallic tribes of the Po Valley, many of whom had been conquered by Rome only recently, proved receptive to Hannibal's message. Here were warriors who remembered freedom, who chafed under Roman rule and welcomed the opportunity to strike back at their conquerors. The Taurini, the first tribe Hannibal encountered after his descent from the Alps, initially refused his overtures of alliance. Their stronghold, a settlement that would later become the city of Turin, stood defiantly against the Carthaginian demands for submission. Hannibal's response was swift and brutal. He stormed the town in a 3-day siege that demonstrated to all who witnessed it that the young general had lost none of his father's ruthlessness. The fate of the Taurini served as both warning and example to other tribes who might consider resistance. As autumn deepened in the Po Valley, Hannibal's army began to recover from the ordeal of the Alpine crossing. The rich farmlands provided ample supplies, and new recruits from the Gallic tribes swelled his ranks. But the Carthaginian general knew that time was not on his side. Every day of delay allowed Rome to mobilize more troops and strengthen her defenses. The first major confrontation came at the Tichinus River, where Scipio's advance guard encountered Hannibal's cavalry in a running battle that would set the tone for much of what was to follow. The Roman horsemen, competent but not exceptional, found themselves completely outmatched by the Numidian cavalry and Spanish horse that formed the elite of Hannibal's mounted forces. These riders, trained from childhood in the saddle, could wheel and charge with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to Roman eyes. In the swirling melee by the river, Publius Scipio himself was wounded and nearly captured, saved only by the intervention of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus, who would one day face Hannibal in the decisive battle of their age. The consul's wound forced him to withdraw his forces to a more defensible position, but the psychological impact of the defeat was far greater than the physical losses. Word spread throughout northern Italy that the Romans had been beaten, that the Carthaginian general possessed some quality that made him invincible in battle. More Gallic tribes began to declare for Hannibal, bringing with them thousands of warriors, eager to settle old scores with Rome. But the Carthaginian general understood that dramatic gestures alone would not suffice. He needed a victory so complete, so devastating, that it would convince Rome's Italian allies that their masters were not invincible after all. The opportunity came in December 218 BCE, when the consul Sempronius arrived from Sicily with reinforcements, raising the combined Roman army to nearly 40,000 men. Sempronius was an aggressive commander, eager for glory, and confident that Roman discipline would prevail over Carthaginian. Cunning, he established his camp near the confluence of the Trebia and Po rivers, preparing for a decisive battle that would crush the invaders and restore Roman prestige. Hannibal, however, had other plans. The Carthaginian general had spent weeks studying the terrain around the Roman camp, noting every fold in the ground, every copse of trees, every stream that might serve his purpose. He knew that in a straight fight, the Roman legion's discipline and training would give them a significant advantage. But Hannibal had not crossed the Alps to fight fair battles. He had come to destroy Rome, and he would use every weapon at his disposal. On a bitter December morning, with frost covering the ground and the Trebia running dark and cold between its banks, Hannibal set his trap. He sent his Numidian cavalry across the river before dawn, with orders to harass the Roman outposts and then retreat, drawing the enemy into pursuit. The bait was irresistible. Sempronius, confident in his superior numbers and eager to bring the campaign to a quick conclusion, ordered his entire army to cross the icy river and attack. The Roman soldiers, roused from their beds before dawn and given no time for breakfast, plunged into Trebia's freezing waters, while the Carthaginians, who had risen early and eaten hot meals, waited for them on the far bank. The crossing was a nightmare of confusion and misery. Men stumbled on the river bottom. Their equipment became waterlogged, and by the time they reached the opposite shore, they were already exhausted and demoralized. But Sempronius pressed forward, confident that Roman valor would overcome these temporary disadvantages. The legions formed their traditional battle line, 3 ranks deep, with the hastati in front, the principes in the middle, and the triarii, the veterans, in reserve. On the flanks, allied cavalry and light infantry prepared to protect the main body from Hannibal's horsemen. The Carthaginian army that faced them was arranged in unconventional fashion, with the least reliable troops, recently recruited Gauls, placed in the center where they would bear the brunt of the Roman assault. On either side of this expendable center, Hannibal positioned his best infantry, the African veterans and Spanish foot soldiers who had followed him across the mountains. His cavalry, still his strongest arm, held the flanks, while a special force of 2,000 picked men lay hidden in the tall grass along a creek bed, waiting for the prearranged signal. The battle began with skirmishing between light troops, but soon the heavy infantry were locked in mortal combat. The Roman hastati crashed into the Gallic centre with their characteristic discipline and fury, their short swords finding gaps in enemy armour, their shields locked together in an impenetrable wall. For a moment, it seemed as though Roman tradition and training would carry the day. The Gallic line began to bend backward under the relentless pressure. But this was exactly what Hannibal had planned. As the Romans drove deeper into his centre, their flanks became exposed to attack from his African and Spanish veterans. Meanwhile, His cavalry had routed the Roman horse and allied troops on both wings, leaving the legions isolated and surrounded. The hidden force of 2,000 men rose from their concealment and attacked the Roman rear, completing the encirclement. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The Roman legions, compressed into an ever-shrinking space, fought with desperate courage, but could not break free from the trap that had closed around them. The winter cold, the icy river crossing, and the lack of food had sapped their strength, while the Carthaginians fought with the fury of men who had survived the impossible journey across the Alps. Only the Roman centre, protected by the elite, Triarii, managed to cut its way through the wavering Gallic line and escape back across the Trebia. Of the 40,000 men who had crossed the river that morning, fewer than 10,000 made it back to the Roman camp. The rest lay dead on the frozen ground or had been taken prisoner, their eagles lost, their pride shattered. The Battle of the Trebia was more than a military defeat. It was a demonstration that Rome's legions were not invincible, that the right general with the right tactics could destroy them utterly. Across northern Italy, tribes that had remained neutral now began to waver in their loyalty. If Rome could not protect herself, how could she protect her allies? As word of the disaster spread southward toward the Eternal City, a new emotion began to take hold in Roman hearts: fear. For the first time in generations, Romans found themselves wondering if their city might actually fall to a foreign enemy. In the Senate House, grave-faced senators debated emergency measures while outside. The common people gathered in anxious crowds, whispering of omens and portents that seemed to herald the end of their world. But Hannibal was not yet finished with his terrible lessons. The winter months would give him time to rest and refit his army, to welcome new Gallic allies, and to plan his next move in the deadly game he was playing with Rome's destiny. Somewhere to the south, beyond the Apennine Mountains, lay the heart of Roman power, and the Carthaginian general had sworn an oath to strike it down or die in the attempt. As the snows fell on the battlefield by the Trebia, covering the frozen corpses of Roman soldiers with a merciful shroud of white, the war between Carthage and Rome entered a new and more terrible phase. The boy who had sworn eternal enmity in a temple in Carthage had kept his promise, and the gods themselves seemed to smile upon his cause. But the greatest tests still lay ahead, and even Hannibal could not know what price his revenge would ultimately exact from both himself and the civilizations locked in their mortal struggle. The winter of 200 BCE descended upon Italy like a shroud of contemplation, wrapping the war-weary peninsula in frost and silence. In the flickering light of oil lamps within Roman homes, mothers whispered prayers for sons who might never return, while in the marble halls of the Senate, voices spoke in hushed tones of a new kind of hope, a hope embodied in a young man whose name would soon echo through the corridors of eternity. Publius Cornelius Scipio was barely 25 when the weight of Rome's destiny began to settle upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and steel. The son of the fallen Scipio, who had perished in Spain, he carried within his veins not merely blood, but the accumulated dreams of generations who had believed that Rome's eagles would one day soar beyond the boundaries of imagination. Yet it was not inheritance alone that marked him for greatness. It was something far more ethereal, a quality that seemed to shimmer in the space between ambition and divine favor. In the halls where senators debated with voices worn thin by Years of desperate counsel, Scipio moved with a grace that spoke of certainty in an age of doubt. His eyes, those who met them would later recall, held depths that seemed to reflect not just the present moment, but the vast sweep of history itself. When he spoke of Spain, that distant land where Carthaginian silver bought loyalty and Carthaginian swords enforced submission, his words carried the weight of prophecy, wrapped in the silk of youthful confidence. The Senate, those grey-bearded guardians of tradition, found themselves facing a paradox that would have amused the gods themselves. Here stood a man who had never held the consulship, who by the ancient customs of the cursus honorum should not yet command armies, yet who possessed something that all their experience and wisdom had failed to provide, a vision of victory that transcended the methodical warfare of their ancestors. In their desperate hours, when Hannibal's name still echoed like thunder across Italian hills, they chose to break their own sacred traditions and grant command to this untested eagle. The ships that carried Scipio and his legions across the Mediterranean moved through waters that had witnessed centuries of Carthaginian dominance. Each wave that broke against their prows seemed to whisper of the merchant princes who had grown wealthy on these trade routes, of the purple-sailed vessels that had carried Phoenician dreams to the far corners of the known world. Yet now these same waters bore a different cargo. Roman steel tempered not just in the fires of war, but in the furnace of desperate necessity that transforms ordinary men into legends. Spain in 210. BCE was a chessboard where the pieces were measured not in ivory and wood, but in the loyalty of tribes and the gleam of silver from mountain mines. The Carthaginian brothers, Hasdrubal son of Gisgo, Mago, and Hasdrubal Barca, had woven a web of alliances that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic shore. Each settlement that flew Carthaginian banners represented not merely military conquest, but an entire economy of war that fed the great machine of Hannibal's ambitions in Italy. Into this carefully constructed world, Scipio arrived like a storm wind that reshapes the landscape with its passing. His first act was not to storm the strongest fortress or seek immediate glory, but to do something far more revolutionary. He listened. In the quiet of his tent, by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on maps drawn from the blood-bought knowledge of Roman scouts, he studied not just the disposition of enemy forces, but the deeper currents of Spanish loyalty that flowed beneath the surface of political allegiances. New Carthage, Carthago Nova, stood like a jewel set in the crown of the Spanish coastline, its harbours sheltering fleets that connected the wealth of Iberian mines to the hungry markets of Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The city's walls, built from stone quarried by generations of labourers, had never been breached by Roman arms. Its treasury held enough silver to fund armies for years, while its harbours contained the naval power that kept Carthaginian supply lines flowing like the very lifeblood of the empire. In the councils of his officers, where grizzled centurions spoke with voices seasoned by decades of warfare, the proposal that Scipio unveiled seemed to dance on the very edge of madness. To march directly upon New Carthage, bypassing the Carthaginian armies in the field, violated every principle of cautious warfare that had sustained Roman arms for generations. It was the kind of strategy that poets might celebrate in epic verse, but that practical soldiers understood led more often to glorious disaster than to enduring victory. Yet Scipio had seen something that escaped the vision of conventional military wisdom, a pattern in the movements of his enemies that revealed not strength, but a fatal dispersion of forces. The three Carthaginian armies, separated by hundreds of miles of Spanish territory, could not support each other if Rome struck swiftly, at the heart of their power, like a surgeon's blade finding the one vital point where pressure would stop a heart from beating. His strategy aimed not at overwhelming force, but at the precise application of audacity guided by intelligence. The march toward New Carthage became a procession through landscapes that had witnessed the ebb and flow of countless civilizations. Roman sandals crossed ground where Iberian warriors had once painted their shields with symbols of tribal gods, where Celtic druids had raised stone circles to honor deities whose names were already fading into the mists of forgotten time. Each mile covered brought Scipio's legions deeper into a land that measured loyalty not in abstract principles, but in the weight of silver and the sharpness of swords. When the walls of New Carthage first appeared on the horizon, rising from their peninsula like a stone dream made manifest in the morning light, the Roman soldiers felt the familiar stirring of emotions that preceded great deeds. Here was the kind of moment that transformed campaigns into legends, where the difference between triumph and catastrophe could be measured in heartbeats. The city's defenders, confident in walls that had never been breached, watched the approaching Roman standards with the kind of detached curiosity that belongs to those who have never truly feared defeat. Scipio's assault on New Carthage unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance where each movement built upon the last in perfect harmony, while his main force demonstrated against the landward walls, drawing the attention of defenders who rushed to man their battlements. A carefully selected group of soldiers waded through the shallow waters of the harbour's lagoon, waters that local fishermen knew became passable at low tide, but which the city's Carthaginian garrison had dismissed as an impassable natural barrier. The moment when Roman eagles first appeared atop the walls of New Carthage marked more than the fall of a single city. It announced the birth of a new kind of Roman warfare, one that combined the traditional virtues of discipline and courage with something that their ancestors might have found unsettling: the willingness to embrace risk as a pathway to transformation. The treasure taken from the city's vaults would fund years of campaigning, but more valuable still was the psychological impact that rippled across Spain like waves spreading from a stone cast into still water. In the great hall of the conquered city, where Carthaginian merchants had once negotiated contracts that spanned continents, Scipio enacted a drama that revealed depths to Roman character that even Rome itself had not fully understood. The Spanish hostages, sons and daughters of tribal chieftains, held to ensure their parents' loyalty to Carthage, were not sold into slavery as the customs of war might have demanded, but were returned to their families without ransom, their chains transformed into gifts that purchased something far more valuable than gold: the voluntary allegiance of those who had witnessed Roman mercy. Among these hostages was a young woman whose beauty had become legendary even in captivity, promised in marriage to a Celtiberian prince whose love for her burned with the intensity of youth meeting its perfect complement. When Scipio ordered that she be returned not only to her family, but with a wedding gift drawn from the spoils of victory, he accomplished something that no amount of military force could have achieved. He transformed potential enemies into allies, who fought not from fear or greed, but from gratitude and respect. Word of such generosity traveled across the Spanish tribes with the speed of wind, carrying the scent of spring flowers. In villages where men had spoken of Romans as just another breed of conqueror, different only in the design of their armor and the language of their commands, stories began to emerge of a young general who understood that true victory was not written in the blood of the defeated, but in the willing cooperation of those who chose to stand beneath Roman eagles. The Carthaginian response to the fall of New Carthage revealed the fundamental difference between the two civilizations now locked in mortal combat. Where Rome adapted and evolved, Carthage reacted with the rigid fury of a commercial empire that understood only the mathematics of profit and loss. Hasdrubal Barca, burning with shame at the loss of the city his family had built into an impregnable stronghold, gathered his forces for a confrontation that would pit Carthaginian experience against Roman innovation in a contest where the very nature of warfare itself would be redefined. The Battle of Becula, fought on rolling hills where Spanish grass grew thick with the memory of ancient reigns, became a masterpiece of tactical evolution. Scipio deployed his legions not in the traditional formation that had served Rome for centuries, but in a new arrangement that combined the flexibility of manipular tactics with innovations born from careful study of Hannibal's own methods. The Roman center held firm while the wings swept forward like the talons of an eagle closing upon its prey, demonstrating that Rome had learned not just to endure Carthaginian genius, but to answer it with genius of its own. Yet Hasdrubal Barca, though defeated, achieved something that would prove more dangerous to Rome than any tactical victory. He escaped with the core of his army intact, his mind already turning toward the long march that would carry Carthaginian hopes across the Pyrenees and into Gaul. His destination was not Spain, where Scipio's growing influence was transforming the strategic balance with each passing season, but Italy, where his brother Hannibal waited with an army worn thin by years of campaigning in hostile territory. Across the Mediterranean, in the war-scarred landscapes of southern Italy, Hannibal felt the subtle shift in fortune's winds, like a sailor sensing the approach of storms still beyond the horizon. The news from Spain arrived not in official dispatches, but in the whispered conversations of merchants and the careful silences of allies whose loyalty had begun to waver like flames in a changing breeze. The loss of New Carthage was more than a tactical setback. It was the first crack in the foundation upon which all his Italian dreams had been built. For 13 years, Hannibal had moved through Italy like a ghost that haunted Roman nightmares, appearing where least expected, striking with devastating force, then vanishing into landscapes that seemed to swallow armies whole. His soldiers, those who had survived the crossing of the Alps and the countless battles that followed, had become something unique in the annals of warfare. Not quite mercenaries, for they fought with passion beyond mere pay, yet not quite citizens of any single nation, for their homeland had become the campfire and the march, the shared memory of impossible victories won against impossible odds. Yet time, that most patient of enemies, had begun to exact its toll in ways that cut deeper than sword wounds. The great elephants that had trampled Roman dreams at Trebia were gone, their bones scattered across Italian hillsides like monuments to the audacity of a man who had dared to bring African beasts to challenge Roman eagles. The original army that had crossed the Rhone and descended into Italy was now a memory preserved mainly in the scarred faces of veterans who spoke in hushed tones of comrades who would march no more. Hannibal's correspondence with his brother Hasdrubal was conducted through codes that transformed military intelligence into what appeared to be routine commercial communications. In letters that spoke of silver shipments and trade agreements, the two greatest enemies Rome had ever faced coordinated a strategy that would either unite their forces in triumphant convergence or see both armies destroyed in the attempt. The plan they conceived was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Hasdrubal would march from Spain through Gaul, following the same route his brother had blazed years before, while Hannibal would march north from his southern Italian strongholds to meet him somewhere in the Po Valley. United, the two Carthaginian armies would represent a force that could not merely threaten Rome, but could potentially dictate terms to a Senate that had exhausted its reserves of men and gold in years of defensive warfare. The vision was intoxicating in its possibilities. Roman resistance would collapse like a structure whose supporting pillars had finally cracked beyond repair, leaving the Mediterranean world to be reshaped according to Carthaginian dreams of a commercial empire spanning 3 continents. Yet even as these plans took shape in the minds of two brothers, whose genius had already rewritten the textbooks of warfare, the Roman response was evolving, with the kind of systematic adaptation that marked the deeper character of the Roman state. In the Senate, where debate had been sharpened by years of crisis into an instrument capable of cutting through to essential truths, a consensus emerged that would have seemed impossible in the early years of the war. Rome would not merely defend against this new threat, but would meet it with a coordination of forces that matched Carthaginian ambition with Roman determination. Marcus Livius Salinator and Gaius Claudius Nero, the consuls chosen to face this ultimate test, represented different traditions within Roman military culture. Yet their combined talents created a synergy that would prove greater than the sum of its parts. Salinator brought the methodical approach of traditional Roman warfare, while Nero possessed the kind of innovative flexibility that the new style of conflict demanded. Together, they would oversee operations that required not just tactical skill, but the ability to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles with a precision that would have impressed the gods themselves. Hasdrubal's march from Spain into Gaul retraced footsteps that had become sacred in Carthaginian memory, each mile marking progress along a route that connected past triumphs with future possibilities. Yet the Gaul through which he now moved was subtly different from the land his brother had crossed years before. Roman influence had begun to permeate tribal politics like water seeping into stone, creating fractures in alliances that had once seemed solid as mountain granite. The Alpine crossing, that test of human endurance against which all military achievements were measured, proved less catastrophic than Hannibal's original passage, but no less demanding of courage that transcended ordinary human limitations. Hasdrubal's army, swollen by Gallic recruits whose loyalty was purchased with promises of Roman spoils, moved through mountain passes where the bones of earlier expeditions served as waymarkers for those who followed. Each step forward was also a step deeper into the kind of commitment that could end only in triumph or annihilation. In Italy, Roman intelligence networks that had been refined by years of warfare against an enemy who seemed to materialize from shadow and mist now worked with unprecedented efficiency to track Hasdrubal's progress. Messages carried by riders who changed horses at stations established across the peninsula brought news of the approaching army to Roman commanders, who understood that they faced not just another military challenge, but a moment when the entire course of Mediterranean civilization would be determined by decisions made in the span of a few crucial weeks. Hannibal, moving northward from his bases in Bruttium with an army that had been hardened by years of campaigning into an instrument of war perfectly adapted to Italian conditions, felt for the first time in years the stirring of emotions that belonged more to hope than to mere professional satisfaction. The prospect of reunion with his brother, of combining forces that had separately terrorized Roman dreams, filled his mind with visions of a final campaign that would transform the Mediterranean world according to Carthaginian will. Yet Roman countermeasures unfolded with a coordination that revealed how much the Roman military machine had evolved under the pressure of Hannibal's genius. Consul Nero, demonstrating the kind of strategic audacity that Scipio was pioneering in Spain, made a decision that violated every principle of conservative Roman warfare. He would secretly detach a portion of his forces shadowing Hannibal and march them north at extraordinary speed to reinforce Salinator's army facing Hasdrubal. The march of Nero's detachment across central Italy became one of those moments when individual human will intersects with the vast forces of history to create something that transcends both. Roman soldiers, carrying equipment that represented the accumulated military technology of centuries, moved at a pace that consumed distance like fire consuming dry grass. Their feet, shod in caligae designed by craftsmen who understood that empires were built one step at a time, covered ground that connected the fate of two armies in a race where victory would be measured not in glory won, but in catastrophe avoided. The convergence of Roman forces near the Mamertine River created an army that was more than the sum of its constituent legions. It was the embodiment of everything Rome had learned about warfare through years of fighting. An enemy who had repeatedly demonstrated that courage alone was insufficient against superior tactical intelligence. When Salinator and Nero combined their forces, they created not just numerical superiority, but a concentration of Roman military evolution that represented the highest development of their military arts. The Battle of the Mamertine River, fought on ground where spring flowers bloomed among grasses that would soon be watered with the blood of two civilizations, became the moment when the tide of the Second Punic War turned with the finality of seasons changing from summer into autumn. Hasdrubal, realizing that his brother's hoped-for message had been intercepted, and that he faced not one Roman army but two, made the kind of decision that belongs to heroes and legends. He would fight with everything he possessed, transforming defeat into a sacrifice that would be remembered as long as men spoke of courage facing impossible odds. The Carthaginian army deployed along the riverbank like a tapestry woven from the dreams of a dozen nations. Spanish infantry whose shields bore designs that spoke of mountain gods and ancient loyalties. Gallic warriors whose long swords caught the morning light like captured lightning. African veterans whose scars mapped the geography of a dozen campaigns fought in the service of Carthaginian ambition. At their head, Hasdrubal rode a horse whose hooves had carried him across half the known world in pursuit of a victory that now seemed to slip away like mist before the rising sun. The Roman assault, combined the disciplined advance of traditional legionary tactics with innovations born from hard-won experience fighting against Carthaginian tactical genius. Each century moved forward with the precision of machinery designed by engineers who understood that war was ultimately a contest between human will expressed through organized violence and human will expressed through organized resistance. The sound of their advance, thousands of hobnailed sandals striking earth in perfect rhythm, created a percussion that seemed to announce the approach of destiny itself. When the battle lines met along the Metaurus, the collision released forces that had been building for over a decade of warfare. Gallic swords met Roman shields in encounters that lasted heartbeats but determined the fate of nations. Spanish infantry fighting with the desperate courage of men who understood that defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of dreams, held their ground until Roman persistence transformed their heroism into tragedy. Hasdrubal's death, when it came, possessed the kind of tragic nobility that poets would celebrate in verses sung around fires for generations unborn. Seeing his army dissolving around him like sandcastles touched by rising tide, he spurred his horse directly into the Roman lines where the fighting was thickest, choosing to die as a warrior rather than flee as a survivor. His body, found later among the Roman dead he had taken with him, was treated with the respect that one professional soldier accords to another who has fought with honor to the very end. The news of Hasdrubal's death traveled southward toward Hannibal with the remorseless speed of fate approaching its appointed hour. The messenger who brought word of the disaster also carried a burden more terrible than mere military intelligence. Hasdrubal's head, preserved in salt and delivered to his brother's camp by Roman commanders who understood that some victories must be announced not just in words, but in symbols that speak directly to the heart. When Hannibal gazed upon the face of the brother who had shared his dreams of Carthaginian empire spanning continents, something fundamental shifted in the eternal mathematics of war and ambition. The man who had terrified Rome for over a decade, who had rewritten the textbooks of military strategy through pure audacity wedded to genius, felt for the first time the weight of mortality settling upon shoulders that had carried the hopes of a civilization whose greatest days now lay in the irretrievable past. The retreat of Hannibal's army toward the southern strongholds of Bruttium marked more than a tactical withdrawal. It announced the beginning of the end of Carthaginian hopes in Italy. Each mile covered in withdrawal was a mile further from the dreams that had sustained Carthaginian ambition through years of seemingly impossible struggle. The soldiers who had once marched with the confidence of men who believed they carried destiny in their sword arms now moved with the careful step of those who understood that they were no longer conquerors, but survivors. Yet even in retreat, Hannibal remained dangerous in ways that transcended mere military calculation. Cornered in the toe of Italy like a wolf trapped in a canyon, he retained the capacity to strike with devastating effect at any Roman force that approached without proper respect for his genius. The Romans, having learned through bitter experience that wounded predators are often more dangerous than healthy ones, settled into a patient siege that sought to contain rather than destroy, understanding that time itself had become their most reliable ally in a war that had already consumed too many Roman lives in attempts to win glory through direct confrontation. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean in Spain, Scipio continued his methodical dismantling of Carthaginian power with a patience that masked the fierce urgency burning in his heart. Each Spanish tribe that transferred its allegiance from Carthage to Rome represented not just a tactical advantage, but a step toward the ultimate confrontation that both civilizations now understood was inevitable. The question was no longer whether Rome and Carthage would meet in the final battle, but where and when that battle would be fought, and whether it would be fought on terms that favored Roman strengths or Carthaginian desperation. The decades following Zama stretched like a held breath across the Mediterranean world. In the marble halls of Rome, senators walked with the measured confidence of victors, their togas rustling against stone floors that had witnessed the transformation of a city into an empire. Yet beneath their triumph lay an unease that would not be silenced, a whisper that spoke of unfinished business across the wine-dark sea. Carthage, stripped of her navy and burdened with tribute, had become something Rome had never intended her to be, a phoenix learning to rise from commercial ashes. The great harbour that once launched fleets now welcomed merchant vessels heavy with African grain and exotic goods from the southern reaches of the continent. The city's artisans, no longer crafting bronze rams for warships, turned their skills to creating beautiful objects that found their way to markets across the known world. In the agora of Carthage, where once Hannibal had walked as a young man, dreaming of elephants and alpine passes, merchants now haggled over the price of ivory and purple dye. The great general himself lived in self-imposed exile, wandering the eastern courts like a spectre of wars past, his very name a reminder of what had been and what might yet be. In Bithynia, in Armenia, in the furthest reaches of the Hellenistic world, he carried with him the memory of Cannae and the bitter taste of defeat at Zama. Rome, meanwhile, had discovered that victory bred its own complications. The legions that had marched home in triumph found themselves dispatched to new frontiers almost before the celebratory wine had dried on their lips. Macedonia fell to Roman arms, her phalanxes no match for the flexible tactics that had been honed in the fires of Punic conflict. Syria trembled before Roman might, and even the proud kingdoms of the East learned to speak with deference when Roman ambassadors arrived at their gates. Yet with each conquest, with each triumph that wound through the 7 hills, the spectre of Carthage grew rather than diminished in the Roman imagination. In the Senate House, Cato the Elder rose with increasing frequency, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade through silk. Carthage must be destroyed, he would declare, the Latin phrase rolling from his tongue with the weight of prophecy. Carthago delenda est. Whether the debate concerned grain imports or theatre performances, road construction or religious festivals, Cato would end his speeches with those same 4 words, until they became less a political slogan than an incantation. The old senator had visited the recovered city during a diplomatic mission, and what he had seen there had filled him with a dread that penetrated to his very bones. Not the dread of military might. Carthage's army was limited by treaty to a mere fraction of its former size, but the dread of economic vitality. The Carthaginians, it seemed, possessed a talent for prosperity that no amount of tribute could entirely suppress. Their ships, though forbidden to carry rams, carried something potentially more dangerous, the promise of wealth that could, in time, purchase new alliances and new opportunities for revenge. In the markets of Rome, African grain had become as common as Italian wheat, and Roman matrons adorned themselves with jewelry crafted by Carthaginian artisans. The very success of the defeated city had become a source of anxiety for its conquerors, a reminder that commerce could be as powerful as conquest in shaping the destiny of nations. The Romans, who had learned to admire Greek culture and Eastern luxury, found themselves troubled by their growing dependence on the prosperity of their former enemy. The passing years brought new generations to power in both cities, men who knew the Great War only through the stories of their fathers and grandfathers. In Carthage, young merchants spoke of Hannibal as a figure from legend. Their pragmatic minds focused on balance sheets rather than battlefield glory. They paid the Roman tribute with the same businesslike efficiency they brought to all their transactions, viewing it as simply another cost of doing business in a world where Rome set the rules. But memory, like wine, sometimes grew more potent with age. In the back rooms of Carthaginian warehouses, old soldiers still gathered to share stories of the campaigns in Italy, their voices dropping to whispers when they spoke of what might have been. They remembered the day when Roman citizens had fled, their city in panic, when the very name of Hannibal had been enough to empty the streets of the Eternal City. Such memories, carefully tended, could smoulder for decades before bursting into flame. The spark, when it came, arrived in the form of a territorial dispute that would have seemed laughably minor to the generation that had fought at Cannae and Zama. Massinissa, the old Numidian king who had thrown his decisive cavalry support to Scipio, had spent the intervening decades steadily encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Each year brought new claims, new demands, new slices carved from the diminishing realm of Carthage. The Romans, bound by treaty to arbitrate such disputes, found themselves repeatedly ruling in favor of their faithful ally. The Carthaginians, their patience finally exhausted, raised an army to defend their remaining lands. It was a modest force, by the standards of the Great Wars, but it violated the terms of the treaty that had ended the Second Punic War. In Rome, the war party seized upon this technical breach with the enthusiasm of hunters who had finally cornered their quarry. Cato's prophecy would be fulfilled at last. The snake, as the Romans had come to think of their commercial rival, would finally be crushed beneath the Roman heel. The Roman ultimatum, when it arrived in Carthage, came wrapped in the silken language of diplomacy, but carried the unmistakable scent of finality. The envoys, their togas pristine and their manner courteous, delivered their message in the great assembly hall, where once Hannibal's father had sworn his son to eternal enmity with Rome. Now that same hall would witness the death sentence of a civilization. The terms began reasonably enough. Carthage must surrender her hostages, 300 children of the noblest families, to guarantee good behavior. The city's leaders, desperate to avoid the fate they saw approaching like storm, clouds on the horizon, agreed without reservation. These young lives, the future of their great houses, were loaded onto Roman ships with tears and prayers, their parents watching from the harbour as the vessels disappeared beyond the horizon. The second demand followed swiftly. All weapons of War must be surrendered to Roman authority. Again, the Carthaginians complied, their armories emptied of swords and spears, their workshops stripped of the tools of military craft. Wagon after wagon rolled to the Roman camp, piled high with the instruments of defense that would never again serve their intended purpose. The great siege engines that had never been used, the catapults and ballistae that had gathered dust in storage, all were delivered to their enemies with the desperate hope that submission might purchase survival. But the final demand, when it came, revealed the true intention behind Rome's careful pageantry of negotiation. The Carthaginians, the Roman envoys, announced with unchanged expressions, must abandon their city entirely. They were to withdraw 10 miles inland, away from the sea that had been their lifeblood for 7 centuries, away from the harbours that had launched their ships to the ends of the known world. Carthage the city would be destroyed, they were told, though the Carthaginian people would be permitted to build anew in some landlocked location where they could trouble Rome's sleep no more. The silence that followed this pronouncement stretched, like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. In that moment, in that great hall where the ghosts of Dido and Hannibal seemed to hover in the incense-laden air, the last illusions of the Carthaginian leadership died. They had surrendered their children, their weapons, their dignity, all in the hope of preserving their city. Now they understood that the city had been doomed from the moment the Roman ships appeared on the horizon. The response, when it came, carried the weight of 7 centuries of proud history. "We cannot abandon the tombs of our ancestors," declared the chief magistrate, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "We cannot leave the temples where our gods have dwelt since Dido first landed on these shores. If Rome demands our city, Rome must take it by force." The Roman envoys departed without surprise or anger. They had expected this answer, perhaps even hoped for it. A city that submitted completely could still be viewed with suspicion by future generations of Romans. A city that resisted to the end and was destroyed in righteous warfare would trouble no senator's sleep. The die was cast, and the final chapter of the Punic story would be written in blood and fire. Carthage prepared for siege with the desperate energy of the condemned. The walls that had protected the city for generations received new attention, their ancient stones supplemented with whatever materials could be found. Citizens melted down their jewelry and household implements to forge new weapons, women cutting their hair to be twisted into bowstrings for the archers who would man the walls. In the great harbour, the last ships were hauled onto dry land and broken apart, their timbers used to strengthen the gates that would soon face Roman rams. The Romans, under the command of Consul Manius Manilius, established their siege works with the methodical precision that had become the hallmark of their military engineering. The great city, which had once seemed to rise from the sea itself like Aphrodite from the foam, found itself slowly strangled by a network of ditches, palisades, and watchtowers. The Roman camps, perfectly ordered and efficiently supplied, settled in for what they knew would be a lengthy siege. Yet the siege, which the Romans had expected to conclude within a single campaigning season, stretched on with a stubbornness that surprised both besiegers and besieged. The Carthaginians, fighting now not for empire or wealth, but for the simple right to exist, discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. Their amateur soldiers, hastily trained and equipped with improvised weapons, held the ancient walls against professional legions that had conquered half the known world. Year followed year, and still the walls of Carthage stood defiant against Roman might. The siege became a byword in Rome itself, a source of embarrassment that demanded increasingly drastic solutions. Consuls were replaced, strategies revised, new commanders sent to complete what their predecessors had failed to accomplish. The Roman people, accustomed to swift victories and glorious triumphs, began to mutter about the expense of maintaining armies in Africa, while other frontiers called for attention. It was in the 3rd year of the siege that Publius Cornelius Scipio, Aemilianus, arrived to take command of the Roman forces. The adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, he bore one of Rome's most illustrious names and carried with it the weight of family expectations. Unlike his grandfather, however, who had faced Hannibal as one great general confronting another, the younger Scipio found himself tasked with the systematic destruction of a dying civilization. Under his methodical leadership, the Roman siege tightened like a garrote around the throat of Carthage. The harbour, which had remained partially open to smugglers and blockade runners, was finally sealed by a massive stone mole that the Romans constructed across its mouth. The city's food supplies, already dangerously low, dwindled to nothing as the last ships found themselves unable to reach the starving population within the walls. Inside Carthage, the scenes that unfolded belonged more to nightmare than to waking life. Families fought over scraps of leather boiled into a tasteless soup. The dead, too numerous and the living too weak to bury them properly, lay in the streets until disease joined famine as an ally of the Roman siege. Children born during the siege knew no world beyond hunger and the constant sound of Roman engines, battering against their city's walls. Yet still the city held, its defenders sustained by something stronger than bread or wine. In the temples, where statues of Melkart and Tanit gazed down with bronze eyes that reflected the flames of the dying city, priests offered prayers not for victory, that hope had long since died, but for the honor of their ancestors and the memory of their gods. They fought now for the right to die as Carthaginians, rather than live as Roman subjects in some anonymous inland settlement. Spring arrived in the 6th year of the siege, bringing with it the final Roman assault that would end 7 centuries of Carthaginian civilization. Scipio had spent the winter months preparing his forces with meticulous care, knowing that this attack must succeed where all others had failed. The Roman war machine, refined through decades of conquest, was about to demonstrate its terrible efficiency against a city that had long since exhausted everything but its stubborn will to survive. The assault began before dawn, as Roman trumpets shattered the pre-dawn silence with their brazen voices. From 3 directions simultaneously, the legions advanced against walls that bore the scars of 3 years of bombardment. The great siege towers, tall as temple spires, and protected by bronze plates, rolled forward on wheels that groaned under their massive weight. Behind them came the ram teams, their bronze-headed battering rams swinging in rhythm like the heartbeat of Mars himself. The Carthaginian defenders, weakened by hunger but not by resolve, met the assault with everything they possessed. Boiling, oil cascaded from the battlements, turning Roman shields into furnaces that trapped the men behind them. Massive stones, hurled by the last working catapults in the city, crashed into the siege towers with enough force to send splinters flying. Like arrows, women and children, too weak to fight but unwilling to hide, carried stones and arrows to the men on the walls, their faces gaunt, but their eyes still burning with defiance. For 3 days, the battle raged across the shattered walls of Carthage. Roman engineers worked under a constant rain of missiles to fill in the defensive ditches, while Carthaginian sorties, desperate and fierce, struck at the siege works wherever they seemed weakest. The city's last reserves of strength were poured out like wine offerings to gods, who seemed to have turned their faces away from their ancient city. On the 4th day, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the walls of Carthage finally yielded to Roman persistence. A section near the harbour, undermined by months of patient sapping and weakened by the constant battering of siege engines, crumbled with a sound like thunder. Through the breach poured the flower of the Roman army, their battle cries echoing through streets that had known peace for half a millennium. What followed was not so much a battle as a systematic destruction that would haunt the dreams of those who witnessed it. The Romans, their discipline maintained even in the moment of victory, moved through the city in ordered formations, clearing each street and each building with methodical thoroughness. Behind them came the flames, set by their own hands, to ensure that nothing of military value would survive to be rebuilt. The great library of Carthage, which had housed the accumulated wisdom of Phoenician civilization, burned with flames that could be seen from the Roman camps miles away. Scrolls containing the maritime knowledge that had guided Carthaginian ships to the ends of the earth crumbled to ash that swirled away on the Mediterranean wind. The records of trade routes that had connected Africa to Europe for centuries became fuel for fires that would burn for 17 days and nights. In the temple of Melkart, the great bronze statue of the god, which had watched over Carthaginian fortunes since the city's founding, toppled with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The priests who had tended the eternal flame for generations died at their posts, their blood mingling with the sacred oil that had burned before their god for 700 years. The flame itself, which tradition claimed had been brought from Tyre by Dido herself, was finally extinguished by Roman hands that showed no reverence for foreign gods. The harbour, which had launched the fleets that challenged Rome for mastery of the Mediterranean, became a furnace as the last ships in the naval yards were set ablaze. The great circular harbour, an engineering marvel that had been the envy of the ancient world, filled with the smoke of burning cedar and the screams of those who had sought refuge among the abandoned vessels. The lighthouse that had guided Carthaginian navigators home for centuries became a torch that would burn until its stone walls cracked from the heat and it collapsed into the harbour it had once illuminated. Hasdrubal, the last commander of Carthage, made his final stand in the temple of Eshmun, which crowned the highest point of the city. Around him gathered the remnants of the garrison, men whose faces were blackened with smoke and whose armour was dented by days of desperate fighting. They had held their positions until the flames licking at the temple walls made further resistance impossible. In the end, even courage had to yield to the simple physics of fire and smoke. When the Romans finally broke into the temple, they found Hasdrubal kneeling before the altar, not in surrender, but in a final prayer to gods who would soon have no worshippers left alive. His wife and children stood beside him, their hands joined in the ancient gesture of family unity that had sustained Carthaginian culture through 7 centuries of triumph and disaster. As the Roman soldiers advanced with drawn swords, the family spoke in unison, the ancient blessing that Carthaginian parents had whispered over their children since Dido had first set foot on African soil. The moment of their deaths marked the end of more than lives. It marked the end of a world. The last words spoken in the Carthaginian language within the walls of Carthage were prayers and blessings, not curses or cries for vengeance. Even in destruction, the people who had been Rome's greatest rivals maintained the dignity that had characterized their long struggle for survival. Scipio Aemilianus, standing among the ruins of what had once been the greatest commercial center in the Western Mediterranean, is said to have wept at the sight of the destruction his armies had wrought. Whether his tears flowed from exhaustion, from the satisfaction of a difficult victory, or from some deeper recognition of what had been lost with Carthage, history does not record. What is certain is that he understood, perhaps better than his soldiers, that something irreplaceable had been consumed in the flames that still rose from the rubble. The destruction continued for days after the last organized resistance had ended. Roman engineers worked with the same methodical precision they brought to building roads and aqueducts, but now their skills were dedicated to ensuring that Carthage could never rise again. The great walls that had protected the city were pulled down stone by stone. Their masonry used to fill in the harbour that had been the source of Carthaginian wealth. The very ground was ploughed with salt, though whether this was done from superstition or mere thoroughness, no chronicler bothered to explain. When the work was complete, when the last stone had been overturned and the last building reduced to ash, the Roman army prepared to depart. Behind them lay not just the ruins of a city, but the grave of a civilization that had shaped the ancient world for 7 centuries. The ships that departed from the African coast carried more than soldiers and booty. They carried the survivors who would be sold in Roman slave markets. Their stories and their memories soon to be scattered across an empire that had no interest in preserving the culture of its defeated enemies. In the years that followed the destruction of Carthage, Roman poets and historians began the long process of transforming their victory into legend. In their telling, the Punic Wars became not merely a struggle between 2 powers, but a cosmic battle between order and chaos, between civilization and barbarism, between the destined rule of Rome and the stubborn resistance of those who would deny Rome's manifest destiny to rule the world. Yet even as they celebrated their triumph, the Romans found themselves haunted by questions they could not easily answer. In the Senate House, where Cato's voice would never again demand the destruction of Carthage, younger senators wondered aloud whether Rome had destroyed a rival or a reflection of itself. The Carthaginians, after all, had been merchants and colonizers, builders of cities and lovers of luxury, not so different from the Romans themselves. In defeating them, had Rome conquered an enemy or merely an earlier version of its own ambitions? The answer, if there was one, lay buried beneath the ruins of Africa's greatest city. In the markets of Rome, where African goods still appeared despite the destruction of their primary source, traders whispered stories of the wealth that had been lost with Carthage, the commercial networks that had connected Europe to Africa, Africa to the Atlantic islands, the Atlantic to the far reaches of the continent, had been severed with consequences that would echo through centuries of economic development. archaeological evidence, discovered by scholars working nearly 2 millennia later, would reveal the scope of what had been destroyed. Carthaginian coins found in British museums, African pottery discovered in Spanish excavations, trade goods from the heart of the continent unearthed in French vineyards, all testified to a commercial empire that had reached into corners of the world that Rome would never effectively penetrate. The destruction of Carthage had closed sea routes and severed trading relationships that would not be fully restored until the age of European exploration. But perhaps the greatest loss was not economic, but intellectual. The Carthaginians had been inheritors of Phoenician learning, keepers of knowledge that stretched back to the dawn of Mediterranean civilization. Their libraries had contained not only the practical wisdom of navigation and commerce, but also the accumulated observations of centuries of contact with peoples from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. When those libraries burned, they took with them the recorded experiences of civilizations that had flourished in Africa's interior, knowledge of astronomical observations made from southern latitudes, and the linguistic keys to languages that died with their last speakers. Inside the ruins of the great city, wild grasses began to grow where once marble palaces had stood. The harbour, filled with rubble by Roman engineers, became a marsh where herons waded among the remnants of quays that had once birthed ships from every corner of the known world. The hill where the temple of Melkart had crowned the skyline became a place where shepherds grazed their flocks, the bleating of sheep replacing the chanted prayers that had honoured gods whose names were already being forgotten. Nature, with its patient capacity for reclamation, began the slow work of healing the scars left by human ambition. Olive trees took root in soil that had been watered with blood, their silver leaves rustling in Mediterranean breezes that carried no echo of ancient battle cries. Vines spread across the foundations of houses where Carthaginian families had told stories of Hannibal's march across the Alps, their tendrils covering the stones with a green shroud that spoke of life's victory over all the works of war. The Romans, meanwhile, found that destroying Carthage had not ended their struggles but had merely begun them. The wealth and manpower that had been devoted to the Punic conflict were soon needed elsewhere as new enemies arose to challenge Roman supremacy. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern frontiers, while in the east, Parthian horsemen proved as elusive and dangerous as Numidian cavalry had ever been. Victory over Carthage had not brought peace, but had merely shifted the theatre of Rome's endless wars to new frontiers and new enemies. More troubling still were the internal conflicts that began to tear at the fabric of Roman society. The wealth that flowed from conquered territories created disparities between rich and poor that would eventually prove more dangerous to Roman stability than any external enemy. The soldier farmers who had formed the backbone of the early legions found themselves displaced by slave labour from conquered lands, while aristocratic families accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the resources of entire kingdoms. In the generation that followed the destruction of Carthage, Rome would face civil wars that would claim more Roman lives than all the Punic conflicts combined. The very success that had allowed Rome to destroy its greatest rival had created internal contradictions that would eventually destroy the Republic itself. The empire that emerged from those civil wars bore the name of Rome, but its character had been fundamentally altered by the wealth and power that victory had brought. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in the Roman conception of warfare itself. The Punic Wars had been the last great conflicts in which Rome faced an enemy capable of threatening its very existence. All subsequent wars, no matter how fierce or prolonged, were essentially exercises in expansion or consolidation. Rome would never again face the existential terror that had gripped the city when Hannibal's campfires burned within sight of its walls. Never again experience the desperate unity that had sustained the Republic through its darkest hours. In that sense, the destruction of Carthage marked not just the end of a rival civilization, but the end of Rome's youth. The city that had grown to greatness in response to external challenges would henceforth face primarily the challenges that came from within, the corruptions of power and the temptations of unlimited wealth, the hard virtues that had been forged in the fires of the Punic conflicts, discipline, sacrifice, loyalty to the state above personal interest, would gradually erode as Rome learned to depend on professional armies and foreign tribute rather than citizen soldiers and Italian farms. The irony was not lost on Roman historians of later generations, who looked back on the Punic Wars as both Rome's greatest triumph and the beginning of its moral decline. In destroying Carthage, Rome had eliminated not just a commercial rival, but a mirror that had reflected its own potential for corruption. The Carthaginians, with their luxury and their dependence on mercenary armies, had represented what Rome might become if it abandoned the austere virtues of its ancestors. In defeating them, Rome had paradoxically moved closer to becoming what it had despised in its enemies. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire itself crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions, the memory of Carthage began to undergo a curious transformation. What had been portrayed as a victory of civilization over barbarism came to be seen by some as the triumph of militarism over commerce, of autocracy over the republican values that both cities had once shared. The Carthaginians, who had been demonized as child-sacrificing merchants, began to appear in some accounts as the last defenders of the ancient Phoenician tradition of maritime democracy. Modern archaeology has revealed the complexity of a civilization that Roman propaganda had reduced to simple stereotypes. The ruins of Carthaginian cities across North Africa and the Western Mediterranean tell stories of urban planning, artistic achievement, and cultural synthesis that challenge the Roman portrayal of their enemies as barbaric merchants interested only in profit. The famous child sacrifices, long cited as evidence of Carthaginian cruelty, appear in the archaeological record as religious practices not fundamentally different from those of other ancient peoples, including the Romans themselves. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery of Carthaginian texts in recent centuries has begun to give voice to a people who had been silenced by their conquerors. These documents, written in the Punic language that died with the destruction of Carthage, reveal a civilization that saw itself not as Rome's evil twin, but as the heir to traditions that stretched back to the dawn of Mediterranean civilization. They spoke of their gods with the same reverence that Romans showed to Jupiter and Mars, wrote of their ancestors with the same pride that filled Roman genealogies, and faced their destiny with the same courage that Romans claimed as uniquely their own. In the end, the Punic Wars remain one of history's great cautionary tales about the price of absolute victory. Rome's triumph was complete, but it came at a cost that would echo through the centuries that followed. In destroying Carthage, Rome had eliminated a rival that might have provided a check on its own imperial ambitions, a commercial alternative to its military model of expansion, and a cultural counterweight to its increasingly autocratic tendencies. The Mediterranean world that emerged from the ashes of Carthage was undoubtedly more unified than it had ever been before, but it was also more homogeneous, more dependent on military force, and more vulnerable to the kinds of internal conflicts that would eventually tear it apart. The diversity that had characterized the ancient world, the creative tension between different models of civilization, was reduced as Rome imposed its vision of order on lands that had once known alternative ways of organizing human society. Today, visitors to the site where Carthage once stood can see the remnants of both civilizations layered one upon the other. Roman ruins rise from Carthaginian foundations, creating an archaeological palimpsest that tells the story of conquest and succession in stone and mortar. The modern city of Tunis spreads across hills where Hannibal once planned his campaigns, while tourists photograph Roman mosaics that cover the graves of Carthaginian merchants. The sea that laps against the shores where Dido first landed remains unchanged, its blue waters reflecting the same Mediterranean sun that warmed both Roman and Carthaginian faces. In that continuity lies perhaps the truest lesson of the Punic Wars, that while human ambitions rise and fall like the tides, the deeper currents of history flow onward, carrying the dreams and failures of ancient peoples into futures they could never have imagined. The great harbour of Carthage, once filled with the rubble of Roman victory, has long since been cleared by the patient work of wind and wave. Fish swim where warships once anchored, and children play on beaches where Roman soldiers once celebrated their triumph. The walls that witnessed 7 centuries of Carthaginian prosperity and 3 years of desperate resistance have crumbled into the earth from which they were first raised, their stones scattered by time's democracy that makes equals of conquerors and conquered alike. In the museum that now occupies part of the ancient site, artifacts from both civilizations rest, side by side in climate-controlled cases, their original conflicts reduced to educational displays for school children and curious tourists. Roman coins and Carthaginian jewelry, weapons from both armies, pottery that once held wine and oil from across the Mediterranean, all have become simply objects of historical interest, their capacity to inspire love or hatred dimmed by the passage of 2 millennia. Yet occasionally, when the wind blows from the right direction across the ruins, carrying with it the scent of olive groves and the sound of waves against ancient stones, visitors report a strange sensation, as if the ghosts of the past were stirring, as if the voices of Hannibal and Scipio, of Dido and Cato, were whispering in languages that no living person can understand. In those moments, the Punic Wars seem not like ancient history, but like yesterday's news, their lessons as relevant to the modern world as they were to the ancient Mediterranean. The story of Rome and Carthage has become, in the end, a meditation on the nature of historical memory itself. We remember the Romans because they won, because they wrote the history, because their language evolved into the tongues we speak today. We struggle to remember the Carthaginians because they lost, because their libraries burned, because their very names survive only in the hostile accounts of their enemies. In that imbalance lies one of the great tragedies of human history: the systematic erasure of alternative voices, alternative visions, alternative ways of understanding what it means to be human. But perhaps, in the end, the greatest victory belongs neither to Rome nor to Carthage, but to the simple fact that their story continues to be told. In every retelling, in every fresh examination of the evidence, in every new interpretation of their conflict, both civilizations live again. They speak to us across the centuries not as Romans or Carthaginians, but as human beings who faced the same fundamental challenges that confront every generation. How to build something lasting in a world of constant change. How to remain true to one's values while adapting to new circumstances. How to find meaning in the face of inevitable mortality. The sea remembers what empires forget. Along the African coast, where Carthaginian ships once carried purple dye and Spanish silver, waves still break against stones that knew the footsteps of Hannibal and Dido. The wind that filled their sails now carries only salt and silence, but beneath the surface of forgetting, deeper currents preserve what fire could not destroy. In the end, neither bronze nor marble proved eternal. Neither the eagles of Rome nor the elephants of Carthage could defeat the patient democracy of time. What remains is not victory or defeat, but the echo of human voices raised in love and anger, in hope and despair, in the eternal conversation between past and future that we call civilization. The stars that watched over Zama still shine above Tunisia. The constellations that guided Carthaginian navigators and Roman legions have not changed their ancient patterns. In their steadfast light, the great dramas of earth seem as brief as candle flames. Yet somehow, in the telling and retelling of these stories, something of their fire continues to burn. Listen, can you hear it? Beneath the traffic of modern Tunis, beneath the sounds of television and telephone, the ancient voices are still speaking. They speak of honor and betrayal, of sacrifice and ambition, of the price that every generation pays for the privilege of being human. They speak, and in speaking they remind us that we too are part of this endless story, this eternal conversation between memory and hope. And so the Punic Wars end not with a conclusion, but with a question that each age must answer anew. What will you build that time cannot destroy? How will you speak across the centuries to hearts not yet born? In what language will you whisper your dreams to the wind that carries all our stories towards shores we cannot imagine? The Mediterranean sleeps, but its dreams are deep. And in its dreams, Carthage and Rome dance together in the eternal ballet of rise and fall, creation and destruction, memory and forgetting. That is the true rhythm of human history. If these ancient voices have stirred something in your soul, if the echoes of Carthage and Rome have found resonance in your heart, take a moment to share this journey with others. Subscribe to continue exploring the endless conversations between past and present, between what was and what might yet be. Let these timeless stories find new ears, new hearts, new dreamers who understand that history is not just what happened, but what continues to happen every time we choose to remember.